So we're live again here on Wednesday, April 3rd. Hope everyone is doing well wherever you are engaging with us from this afternoon. As we get ready to get underway, let us say a word of prayer. Our prayer today comes to us from the Ragamuffin Gospel. It's on page 121. If you have the book in front of you, you can read along. If not, by all means, please pray with me. Abba, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will, whatever you may do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. Let your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Into your hands I commend my spirit. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart. For I love you, Lord, and I surrender myself into your hands without reserve, with boundless confidence, for you are my Father. Amen. We are going to be in chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the Ragamuffin Gospel today. Now, this will continue some of the discussions we've had in the previous week, but also will allow us to focus a little bit more on what Manning is trying to convey and what Manning is trying to get across. And so chapter 6, the title of this chapter is Grazie, Signor. And it's just, thank you, my Father. Thank you, Dad. A few things to bring up that Manning talks about a little bit right at the beginning of the book. The beginning of this chapter on page 108, he talks a little bit about Jürgen Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, and he quotes Moltmann as saying, "We have made the bitterness of the cross, the revelation of God in the cross of Jesus Christ, tolerable to ourselves by learning to understand it is a necessity for the process of salvation." In doing so, what Manning is quoting Moltmann of trying to convey is that a lot of the what goes on with the cross, with the trial and conviction of Jesus in the kangaroo court that was going on in Jerusalem at that day and at that hour, about his humiliation, his pain, and being whipped by the Roman soldiers in the carrying the cross up the way, the Via Dolorosa, going up to Calvary, about what the pain that was involved. In a lot of ways, we have discounted the significance and really the brutality of what Jesus encountered there on that Good Friday, and something really that I think a lot of us at sometimes have points have wondered, why do we call it Good Friday? And in a lot of ways we have missed the message of the harshness of the cross, about the scandal of the cross, because we simply see it as a means of salvation. And one thing Manning talks about is going up and down the French Quarter in New Orleans. And when he does this, he is greeted with the burlesque shows and the bars and the restaurants, the jazz clubs, but also the shops that are selling various items, and think about the various types of Jesus and the crucified. He says, the Venus cost more, the antique dealer says to him, but this ivory Christ crucified is beautiful in its own way, especially against a black velvet backdrop. And Manning writes, and the more we reproduce him, the more we forget about him and the agony of his third hour. The more that we reproduce things, and sometimes even the more that we get comfortable with Lent, and the more we get comfortable with the Holy Week that we are headed towards, the more it loses, or we forget, or we stop to remember. And I mentioned this book last week by Miroslav Volf, and the book is called The End of Memory, and the other title of it is Remembering Rightly in a Violent World. And one thing that Volf tries to convey and get the message across is that it's not just enough to remember, but it requires work on our end to remember rightly. Remember times in our own life when we have been wronged, when we have wronged as well, but to remember those things accurately. And when we fail to remember things accurately, then we are incomplete in our humanity. He talks about, the reason I bring him up is the symbol of the cross, which is fairly ubiquitous in our lives to where we don't even notice it. We, of course, we see the cross in the front of the church. We have crosses on hospitals. We have crosses on pharmacies. We have these huge debates over the cross on public lands, and we see crosses everywhere. And so much jewelry in the scandal of the cross is lost. One thing that Wolf writes that's resonated with me for many years is, we demand immediate memorials as outward symbols because the hold of memory on our inner lives is so tenuous. And then because we have tangible, observable memorials, we feel absolved of the obligation to remember on our own. We feel free, in good conscience, to immerse ourselves in the blur of the presence. Thus does the memory boom try to compensate for an actual memory bust. That's a lot of things to digest just in those few sentences. But I think what Wolf is trying to convey is that we create these memorials. We're in a rush, he talks about, after 9/11, to put up these memorials, because in doing so, then they do the memory for us. We no longer have to worry about that, and we can get into the busyness of our life, the blur of daily living. Lent at its best is a season of intentionality, a season to remember rightly what Jesus has done, remember rightly about our own lives, the joys, and also the personal shames that we have. We don't want things to get out. But to remember the cross rightly is to remember also what the message, beyond the brutality of it, the message of what wondrous love must come out of this for us, of God's love for humanity. There's a beautiful, beautiful story that Manny tells at the beginning of this chapter about a woman that has to go in for surgery, and in order for the doctor to do the surgery and to make sure it is effective, the doctor has to cut a nerve. And so when she comes to, and when she talks to the doctor, she asks how long it'll be like this, how long will her mouth be contorted. And the doctor says, because of the surgery, because of the nerve we had to cut through, it's always going to be like that. And there was a man that was in the room, a young man, and he didn't know exactly the relationship, thought it might be the husband, but it turns out it was the husband, who then comes forward, tells his wife how much she means to him, how beautiful she is. And he leans down, and he contorts his mouth to her mouth to give her a kiss. And it's such a beautiful image of the relationship of God with us, about God contorting God's self to convey God's love for us. And the symbol of the cross is a powerful image for that. It is the thing that is offered, the greatest thing that is offered, that says you are accepted, you are loved, broken as you are. Will you accept this? And Wolf talks a lot moving forward that the only way that we can accept this is in honesty. And honesty, to quote Billy Joel, is such a lonely word. I think we mentioned that last week as well, because the thing that the conversion we're supposed to go through is a daily conversion from mistrust to trust. That is the things in our spiritual lives. There's a lot of things in our lives, in the secular world, in government, in business, and politicians who promise the world are the people on television, even televangelists who promise even eternity in return for your personal check. There's so much mistrust in the world, and maybe rightly so. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. But in our spiritual lives, we are always moving from mistrust to trust. when we trust, that begins the process of belief, in the process of a deeper faith, and the ability to take risks. We're going to talk about this a lot on this coming Saturday and Sunday at our worship services, because it's the story of Mary and Martha and Jesus, and they're in Lazarus' house, and he's been raised from the dead, and it's coming close to the time where Jesus is going to be crucified, and Mary takes this great risk of breaking opening the bottle of pure nard. Imagine about a year's wages to pay for this pound of nard, and she anoints Jesus's feet with it. And in that, just that extravagance of risk, of her seeing Jesus for whom he really is, for who he really is. And I think that is perhaps the great risk of all. It is also moving from our individual selves to a trust in something greater, because we know our hearts, we know where we miss the mark, we know where we are broken in our lives, but still it is the devil, perhaps we know. It's what Manning mentions on page 117. Preoccupation with self is always a major component of unhealthy guilt and recrimination. It stirs our emotions, churning in self-destructive ways, closes us in upon the mighty citadel of self, leads to depression and despair, and preempts the presence of a compassionate God. The language of unhealthy guilt is harsh. It is demanding, abusing, criticizing, rejecting, accusing, blaming, condemning, reproaching, and scolding. It is one of impatience and chastisement. This is the truth of all of us. Guilt, I mentioned before, I don't believe guilt comes from God, and Manny and I might come to a disagreement on this, because he talks about unhealthy guilt and healthy guilt. I think the word guilt has been used so much, and we hear it so much in our own heart, that I don't know that we have to have a better name for what Manning calls healthy guilt, because I think mostly it is unhealthy. Perhaps it is conviction, the conviction of sins, or a epiphany or realization of the path we're on is self-destructive, and there perhaps is a better path that God and Christ that they are calling us to. We need to move from the question of what can we do, because with guilt, we can do nothing with it. It simply weighs us down with anxiety and with fear and loathing, so much self-loathing, that the question is not what can we do, but the better question is, what can God do with us? What Manning says is there is an essential connection between experiencing God, loving God, and trusting God, that we need to have that experience of God. I mean, if it's conversion, some people say it's conversion, others will say it's that strange warming in our heart. Others will say it's just simply the realization that we are loved, and we're loved unconditionally. Language is always incomplete with that, and the words are loaded. But I think there is beauty in simply experiencing God. And the more we experience God, the more we trust God. The more that we the more we experience God, the more we love God. The more we love God, the more we trust God, because that love does not abandon us. So again, Manning keeps coming back to trust. The third characteristic he mentions is heartfelt gratitude. And in this bit on 121, he mentions the famous O. Henry short story on the gift of the Magi, the story of this couple that are very poor. The woman has this long hair, the man has this watch, and what they do for one another is the woman sells her hair, has it cut so that she can buy the man a chain for his watch. The man sells his watch so he can buy the woman he loves a brush for her beautiful hair. It is the selflessness that stands out to us. It is that gratitude that we are loved that speaks to our generosity in our lives. it is not a conversion by the concussion message that Manning mentioned. The concussion message that sometimes we'll hear at churches, that they're going to scare the hell out of us, or scare the devil out of us. This thing that's based off fear to lead to conversion. And we're told that perfect love drives out fear, but yet it is a tool that is oftentimes used in a church for the purpose of converting somebody, to make someone so afraid to accept the fact that they are so loved. And the world feels so upside down with that. I do want to talk a little bit about chapter 7. We're going through chapter 6 and chapter 7 tonight, and Manning talks about paste jewelry and sawdust hot dogs, the things that we trade in, the things, you remember I think Coca-Cola has been called a number of things with its ad lines, but I remember when it was called the real thing, a way for people to say, I don't want Pepsi Cola, RC Cola, or Rocky Top Cola. I want the real thing. I want Coca-Cola. It's a powerful ad campaign, because I still remember it after all these years. But there's so much, frankly, that is not real in our world, that we trade in as a substitute for God's love and God's acceptance. A lot of what Manning talks about here is from his own personal experience in the mid-1970s, being in a alcoholics rehabilitation center, and this man who is working off of the image, the self-delusional image of he is not sick, that he does not really need to be there, that he is not willing to confront his demons and what he has done and what alcohol has destroyed in his life, the demon of alcoholism. And through I can't do the story justice completely right now, but through a lot of phone calls with the whole group, there's tough love that is going on. There is tough love that is forcing us to look at where we miss the mark, not with the end goal of guilt or a faith that's based on guilt, but a goal to realize that we are broken. And in that brokenness, in that complete emptiness, there begins the spirit of transformation. We're all ragamuffins. We all have to acknowledge that we are sinners. And what that leads to at its best is that when we realize we are completely empty, it leads to a desire for the real thing, and the thing that will feed us and that will fill us. In James chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, the author writes, "The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up. And anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and to pray for one another, so that you may be healed. The prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective." I think there's a lot of power in corporate prayer, and coming together for a corporate prayer of confession. But I think sometimes what we lose, even though we have that silent time to confess our own sins with God, is that the ability to talk to another, to have that accountability, to have that relationship with someone, to be completely honest with them about where we miss the mark, to be candid about our brokenness without fear. And Manning makes a real interesting point here, if I can find it in my book. It says, "At Sunday worship, as in every dimension of our existence, many of us pretend to believe we are sinners. Consequently, all we can do is pretend to believe we have been forgiven." I think what Manning is getting at is that when we come to church, if we are putting on airs, if we are simply trying to look the part, and even the part of sinners, and kind of laugh it off of, oh yeah, well, I've done that too, but these minor sins, and ignore the greater void in our lives, that rot that comes from the inside out, that is sin. When we pretend to be sinners, we only receive maybe perhaps a pretend grace. God's not interested in being dazzled by our accomplishments. the diplomas on our walls, the great deeds that we think we have done. We have to recognize that all of these are a gift. Even the desire to pray and the desire to attend worship, the desire to be involved with the mission of God and to participate in mission trips, but also simply the mission of going out into a broken world and going out there in trust and faith in God. Manning says what happens if we surrender control of our souls to rules, that we're not simply fighting the battle between, do we worship Jesus on one hand or Barabbas on the other, the two criminals, Jesus who was unfairly convicted, an innocent man who gets convicted to death, and there's a longer discussion on that with our judicial system here in the country and what we see around the world, and Barabbas, who is the guilty man who was set free. Jesus says Manning says we have to look at to compare ourselves between Jesus on one hand and Caiaphas on the other, the one who represented grace in Jesus, and the one who represented the law and the way things have always been done to maintain the status quo on the other. This spoke a lot to me because I think oftentimes that is where the church is. The church is because we are not willing to step out in faith. We're not willing to risk all. The final thing on page 144, to bring the truth of ourselves just as we are to God, just as God is the most dignified thing we can do in life. So may you seek to look and do some soul searching this week to see who you really are, and be willing to bring that really to God in the truest sense. And whatever those sins are, those anxieties, those fears, those things that have come from the past that we don't want to be about anymore, the things we want to let go of today, be honest with those and bring those to God honestly. And this is the message of the cross, is to say, to leave our sins there, to be nailed there, that not carry those burdens anymore. So may you be blessed with that this week. We will continue to have our discussion tonight at St. Mark at 6:00, and you're welcome to join us there and be back here same time, same channel next week. May God bless you.